Good morning, interpersonal communication. Today we're going into chapter 8, culture and communication. Got a lot of stuff to talk about, so what we're going to do is we're just going to sort of jump into it. Culture and what culture is and how we define culture is going to be the topic of the lecture today and how that impacts our communication. What culture is a subject for debate, and we'll talk about that as we go through the definitions. Culture. A lot of times you hear in the last several years, one political party or the other has attempted to define a culture war, or how we engage in politics and our definition of American culture and what American culture should be is the subject of debates and discussions, and people attempt to use how we define American culture and what American culture is or should be is a way to leverage political points. We constantly, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in detail later on, we talk about cultural appropriation and how that, and we'll discuss how that can affect our communication. The first thing we're going to do, though, is we want to start off with a definition. Turning to the source of all relevant knowledge in the world, Wikipedia, culture is a word for the way of life of groups of people, meaning the way we do things. Different groups may have different cultures. A culture is passed on to the next generation by learning, whereas genetics are passed on by heredity. Culture is seen in people's writings, religion, music, clothes, cooking, and in what they do. Key thing I want you to take out of that is different groups have different cultures. Again, we talk a lot, and again, there's a lot of talk in politics about the American culture, when in truth there is no American culture. There are multiple cultures. People here in South Carolina's culture is radically different from those of Vermont, where my in-laws live. People that have lived in California. That culture is radically different than the culture we have here. Do we have certain core common beliefs? Yeah, we do, but that doesn't mean our cultures have to be the same. Merriam-Webster says the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group, the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institute or an organization, the integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior that depends on the capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. So again, we hear from Merriam-Webster a couple of things. Number one, that we can have cultures within religious, racial, and social groups. It defines and it has a shared attitudes, values, and goals. And then again, we hear that a culture is passed down to future generations. Because if we can't pass our culture down, clearly the culture is unsustainable. The last one is going to be Cambridge English Dictionary. The way of life of a particular people, especially as shown in their ordinary behavior and habits and their attitudes toward each other and their moral and religious beliefs. Again, focuses on a group of people, a finite group of people. In other words, our culture cannot extend universally to all 7 billion of us, okay? And it would be impossible to expect that. I do like the definition in the book, although you can read it, so that's why I don't cite it. It does have one characteristic that I really liked, is that culture is negotiated. We're going to talk about negotiating culture as we get into the lecture, because Americans believe that there is this American culture as if it was handed down to us from the Almighty, when in truth our culture, in almost every aspect of it, goes through changes that we negotiate, that we engage in the discussions of. And we're going to talk about that. But first, let's talk about layers of culture. Layers of culture. Okay? The first one we want to talk about is national culture. Now, when we say national culture, oftentimes we think about the culture of the United States, the culture of Great Britain, the culture of Nigeria, the culture of China. The thing I want you to think about, though, is nation is really not necessarily defined as the United States, because the United States is a country. I want you to differentiate country from nation, okay? Great Britain is, well, that's even geographic. Britain is an island that's composed of England, Wales, and Scotland. Okay? The countries in Britain are Scotland in the north, England in the center, and Wales on the western side of that one island. Okay? So the national identity and the national culture of Great Britain would have, and then you can also throw in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. So when we say the nation of the United Kingdom, that's a country. The nations that compose the United Kingdom are Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Okay? So the national identities of the United Kingdom would have Scots, the Welsh, the English, and the Northern Irish. Okay? So these would be the nations. In this country, historically, one region of the country, the South, those 11 to 13 states, depending on how you count, that decided to break away, we can still make an argument that that is a national identity, and that the echoes, and even if we don't aggressively pursue ideas that the Confederacy is still a separate nation, the echoes of that divide still reverberate into the 21st century. People don't believe that? Fine. Go find somebody from the Big Ten and tell them, and get somebody that's from like Ohio, and get them talking about football. And you will get, an Ohio and a Michigan guy and a guy who went to Penn State and a guy who went to Notre Dame can all be sitting in a room. And there's a guy that went to South Carolina, a guy that went to Georgia, a guy that went to Auburn, and a guy that went to Mississippi State. These 8 people are sitting in a room, and all of a sudden they start talking football. Well, those 4 guys may all be, separate and arguing with each other. But the 4 guys from Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi are all immediately going to bond together in a national identity and saying, yeah, that's all fine, but if you don't play in the SEC, you just don't play football. Okay? So while national identity here in the United States is something that is to a great extent mellowed, it still exists and we still need to be aware of it. So the first layer that we're going to talk about is national. But again, remember, nation and country are 2 separate things. Right? The second will be, and again we've talked about this, regional. And again, some of that goes back to a pseudo-national identity. Yeah, certainly here in the South, we have a regional identity that is contextualized to a great extent by race. But then again, as you move outside of the South, a lot of times I see Southerners of multiple races bonding together because they are from the South. Certainly New England has a regional identity. All right, California and the Pacific Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington all have that they have a very strong regional identity. Those states that are mostly taken up by the Rocky Mountains, they have a very distinct regional identity and culture as well. The regional identity can be associated with ethnic, linguistic, or religious differences that exist within a specific region. Okay? Like the difference in the regional identity, and again, well, okay, I'll leave that. I'll bring it back up later. There is a gender layer. And again, this should be fair. We're going to talk about gender in great detail in a minute. Okay? The source I had is a couple of years old, but it said the differences between male and female gender. Well, we know now that gender is much more complex than just male and female. There's a generation layer. Okay? Again, and it's beginning to something that I'm beginning to experience and feel. I have, for most of my life, adult life, I've always worked with people that were in, through my work with the Department of Defense, I've always worked with people that were in their mid to late 20s, mid 20s to early 30s. Most of the people I worked with coming up were in that age group because that's where most military people fall into. And as I got older, that sort of stayed the same. So I don't pretend to be part of that generation, but I have had contact with that generation. Well, because of my age and because of my contemporaries are all now in their, in their 50s and early 60s, and as they aged up, the work groups that they worked with, the social groups that they were engaged in, aged up with them. And so now I see a vast generational divide. A couple of years ago, I went to my 35th high school reunion. And we were all in our early 50s. I think I was 53 at the time. And we go walking into this reunion, and I went with a good friend of mine that I've known literally since first grade, named Lee, and his wife Martha. And so we go walking in, and we'd been out to dinner together. We go walking in, and we all four of us, nobody said anything. As we turned in and went into this big room where the big party was happening, we all just sort of stopped, and nobody said anything. We just stopped, and then finally my friend Lee is like, my Lord, apparently we went to high school with our parents. Because suddenly everybody was dressed like, there had been this great generational shift. Now, that being said, Lee and I had both been out of circulation. I'd been overseas. I was deployed for our previous reunions. Lee had just not chosen to engage with high school because he did not have a positive experience in high school like I had. But when we walked in there, suddenly our contemporaries in those 20 years that we had missed them, and it looked to us like they had suddenly gotten joined our parents' generation, while we were still working with, and Lee worked for a major computer hardware manufacturer. So he, again, is much like me, works with that younger group. So the generational shift and the generational culture that was engaged there was very obvious to us. There's something we like to think in America we don't have, but we do: social class. There ain't no doubt, if you grew up, with there's levels of privilege that we have associated with social class. You get different educational opportunities. You have differences in occupation, so we have to be aware of that. And then we have what we call a corporate level. Now, corporate can indeed refer to a corporation, like a business or a large company. Okay, corporate also involves just any formal institutions. Okay, anybody that is incorporated. Okay, a church would be a corporate entity. A social club like the Lions or the Masons or the Shriners, they all have a corporate culture. When you're engaged and you're with that group, you're expected to conduct yourself in a certain way. Okay, I think we've all had an experience where at some point in time, growing up in a Southern church, one of the ladies of the church or your mother or your father would look at you and say, "We don't do that in church." And I remember one time when I was a young kid, one of the ladies of the church looked at me and said, "We don't do that in church." And I just looked at her and went, "Do you do it out of church?" And of course, that did not go well for me for the rest of the day. So within those corporate entities, those formal organizations, okay, we have expectations of how will we behave, how we communicate, how we engage with each other. All right. Here's the thing: these are not distinct. These are all overlapping. Okay. My national identity maybe is an American, but I am also, I freely and openly admit, I'm a Southerner. And more importantly than that, to me, I'm an Alabamian. Okay? Even though I live in Georgia and work in South Carolina, if somebody asks me, "Where are you from?" I say Birmingham, Alabama, because that is core to my identity. We're going to talk about identity in about 2 seconds. How I engage as a male member of this culture, okay? A male person in this culture. My generation, okay? I am the tail end of the baby boom. We grew up with incredible privilege. I am fully aware of that fact. Our parents won World War II. Our parents survived the Great Depression, all right? My generation is incredibly privileged. Unfortunately, many of my contemporaries don't realize that. I grew up in a lower middle class family. I grew up in a blue collar household. Okay, so I still carry a lot of that blue collar mentality with me when I go out. My jobs during college, I worked on a highway patch crew, which meant I shoveled asphalt out the back of a truck in Jefferson County, Alabama for 4 summers. Okay, I still, and a lot of people that I have engaged with have said to me, well, you got a lot of blue collar attitudes about things. And I think they say that as an insult, but I take it as a great compliment that I've been able to stick, even though I've had a very privileged life, and I rarely, if ever, do physical labor now that I don't do voluntarily. I still think of myself as coming from definitely that blue-collar, lower middle-class family. And then as a corporate entity, I am a member of a lot of service organizations. I am the faculty advisor for the Student Veterans Association here. I expect, as the advisor for that, I expect our student veterans, when they're out as student veterans, to conduct themselves in certain ways, so that we don't perpetuate certain stereotypes about veterans, and so that we earn a good reputation here on campus. Okay. All right. So those are the layers. Again, those engage on multiple different levels. National, regional, gender, generational, social class, and corporate. Okay? Now, culture is important. Okay? Because we need to understand this. Our sense of self, okay, our sense of who we are, we can say our identity is tied to the cultures we come from. Remember, there's 7 different cultures that we dealt with there, 7 different layers of culture. Even if we wholly reject the culture we grew up in, okay? Even if you reject the corporate culture of, let's say, the Catholic Church, even if you reject the national culture of, whatever, Japan, okay? Or the national culture of if you want to say it, even if you reject American culture. If you reject the gender layer of culture, you don't want to identify as binary, as male or female. Your identity is still defined not just by the culture you've adapted, but even in rejecting that culture, you identify as not being in that culture, okay? So a lot of times people say, well, I rejected the culture of my parents, so I'm not. Yeah, but your identity is still defined as rejecting that culture. That culture is still tied to you, okay? We have multiple identities, and each operates in a slightly different level that comes from this identity. We have a personal identity. Now, your personal identity is what you use primarily in intrapersonal. It's communication, if such exists. It is intrapersonal. It's connected directly to your life experiences. It is who you are at your core when you're not trying to shield anything. And a lot of times, nobody ever really sees that. I would say for most people, all of us have something deep in our core that we just don't want to talk about, that we just have trouble sharing with other people, even people that are very close to us. Okay, then we have our social identity. And your social identity, okay, is derived from the social groups that you are interpersonally committed to. This is not just something you just sort of, I have a social identity. Does that include that? That's with my close friends. Do I employ that social identity at the Walmart? No, we're going to talk about what identity you employ there. Social identity, again, the key phrase there is going to be derived from social groups that you are interpersonally committed to. Okay? So if I'm going to go out and I'm a member of a dinner club and there's 4 couples in the dinner club, if I go out and I'm a complete ass at one of the dinner clubs, I never get invited back. The dinner club begins to break down. Nobody wants to have anything to do with me. So I think one of the things about social identity, your social identity is it's for groups that you expect to have ongoing interpersonal communication with. Okay, it's not going to be a one-off. It's going to be something you engage with routinely. Then last, we have our cultural identification. Cultural identification is socially constructed categories that teach us who we are and what our behavioral expectations are. Okay? When we go to the Walmart and we assuming you don't self-check, okay, and you put your stuff up on the conveyor belt, you're expected to have interactions with the Walmart cashier. Culturally, we know and we've been taught how to engage with that. Okay? How are you today? I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. Did you find everything you need? Yes, I did. Okay? A lot of that we might even interpret that conversation is meaningless, but it's not. It's an indicator through interpersonal communication that we are culturally identified with that person and we know how to culturally engage. So that person has expectations as we engage culturally in that interpersonal communication. That person knows exactly what to expect from us. Okay? Now, identities can be, let me make sure I spell this right. They can be ascribed. Now, an ascribed identity is an identity somebody puts on you. Okay? All the time I get, and again, people of you from people that are of European descent that have from the South that have traveled outside the South know that we are oftentimes categorized without any evidence necessarily. They think, and again, I've been called this directly, they say we're racist because that's the ascribed identity. And sometimes you have to work against that, but you have to acknowledge that it may not be true, but you have to understand that. Excuse me. So there's ascribed identity, and then there's avowed identities. I've known people from the South that as they travel around work very hard not to be ascribed as a Southerner. I know people that travel outside the South who are avowed Southerners and very loud and proud about it. So what I want you to remember, though, is that these identities are not fixed. Especially this avowed identity. We can change our identities over time. Okay? As we age, parts of our identities become more important and take on greater importance to our lives. Groups we have associated with our social identities can change. Okay? And cultures and expected behavioral norms can shift and change, forcing us to conform to new cultural standards. Again, if we take these in order, and again, I'll talk about myself. I don't mind doing that. When as I was growing up, okay, I consider myself to be American. I rejected people who wanted to identify as a specific subgroup of Americans, German American, Polish Americans, any of those other national identifiers. I was very adamant about that in my 20s and 30s. I'm a student of history, and as we went to the United Kingdom, and we lived in the United Kingdom for 5 years, I got a chance to visit Scotland a lot. I got a chance to visit Ireland a lot, and I became very interested in Irish and Scottish culture, which I come from, and I've done the genealogical research to know exactly what parts of both of those countries I come from. I got a chance to see that, and I became very engaged. And so now, as I grew older, my identity became very associated with, saying, I am an American of Scottish and Irish descent. And that to me is a very important part of my identity, knowing that my Scottish ancestors came here during a period of time called the Highland Clearances after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. We're going to talk about it. It was a time of extreme hardship for the people of the Scottish Highlands. My mother's side of the family, the Irish side of my family, came to the United States in the mid-18th century at the height of the Irish potato famine, where a quarter of the population died from starvation and another quarter of the population immigrated. And even on those ships, they called them coffin ships because thousands and thousands of Irishmen died on that transit across the northern Atlantic Ocean. So the hardship that my ancestors went through just to get to this country and survive that has become something I'm very proud of and very identified with. That has grown over time. Now, when I was younger, I was a member of the U.S. Army. That formed a core part of my identity for years. But I retired from federal service and left the Department of Defense 4 years ago in 2015. a little over, it was August 31st, 2015, I retired. As I have moved away from that, my affiliations with that military has begun to shift where I'm not, I still identify a core part of my being is that I'm a veteran, and I show that by working with our veterans groups here. But my identity with that group has begun to shift. My social identification has begun to shift. I don't take so much as I was a soldier to I'm now a veteran. It's kind of a grayish thing, but yeah, there's a difference. And then finally, as far as culture is concerned, I look back on the culture I worked in when that I lived in when I was in college. I was very politically conservative when I was in college. I'm not so politically conservative now. So a lot of the groups that I associated with, the behaviors I expect from people, the behaviors I expect of myself have shifted radically in the last 30 or 40 years. It's been a growing progression. Our identities are at a personal level, which is really intrapersonal, social level, which is groups that we are engaged with and expect repeated engagement on an interpersonal level. Then a cultural identification guides our behaviors when we don't really necessarily have a personal relationship with the individuals that we're going to be communicating with. Again, those can be ascribed. You can have them get pushed on you, or they can be avowed, which is saying, I take this is who I am, and we accept that voluntarily and assign it to ourselves. But the key thing to remember is identities, which are tied to our cultures, are not fixed because our cultures will shift. Okay? Now, let's talk about some specific cultural identities that we deal with in this country on a regular basis. Okay? First of all, one of the ones that we deal with constantly and have been dealing with since for 400 years now, in 1619, 400 years ago, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. So for 400 years, we've been grappling with race, and we still haven't got a whole lot of focus on. We haven't come up with answers. Let me say that. Race. Let me say this, and this is gonna blow your mind. Race is a social construct and not necessarily defined by genetics. Okay? Everybody needs to understand that. And this, especially in this country, race is a social construct. And it's not just in this country, but in places like the Bahamas, in places like the Caribbean. I've had specific experience with the Bahamas. In places like the Caribbean and parts of Africa. Even after those Caribbean nations achieved independence from their European colonial states, for years they continued to elect leaders that were of European descent. The convenient way to say that is they elected white politicians to their key roles. It was a while after the Bahamas was allowed to have their own election and select their own prime minister, before they elected a person of African descent to that position. Okay? Lupita Nyong'o has been talking a lot over the last couple of months about colorism in African culture, where people, lighter-skinned African people, are advanced quicker through their socioeconomic and political structures than people of dark skin. And she talks about in great depth and with great personal pain about how as a dark-skinned child in her country, she was told that she wasn't as pretty and she wasn't going to be as successful. Race in this country is a social construct. Figure 8.2 will give you a good rundown on how race has changed legally and culturally. There's a lot of details there. Okay? Usually race goes hand in hand, especially in this country, with the power. Okay? One of the ways we maintain and identify the ruling power class is based on their race. Okay? Inclusion in groups shifted to requirements to maintain power, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And terms are often so broad that we use to describe race, they're just not useful. Okay? A good example. One of the when the census comes out next year, if it has a racial, I haven't looked in detail, but many times when we're asked to voluntarily provide race, I was doing a thing on the Kroger website, and they asked, what race I identify with, and one of the ones down the bottom said, prefer not to give it, but one of the groups is Asian Pacific Islander. Now I want you to think about that phrase, Asian Pacific Islander. So Asia goes all the way around from the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, Asian Pacific Islander would cover all the way from Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Okay, all the way around to New Zealand. Okay, that's half the world's population, all covered under one ethnic heading. Okay, so what you're basically saying is Lebanese, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia, Vanuatu, Fiji, Australia, New Zealand, all those people are ethnically the same. 3 billion people covered under one big umbrella. Okay? So that term, Asian Pacific Islander, means very little. Closer to home, having grown up, having lived for a while in San Antonio, I knew a lot of people, and we used to call it the acceptable phrase back in the 80s and 90s was people with Hispanic surnames, people from the continent of South America, Central America, or the previously Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. They really bridled at all being lumped under the category of Latin American. One of the sergeants that worked for me, Carlos, was Puerto Rican, and he did not like being stationed in San Antonio because everyone assumed that he was Mexican. He was very proud of his Puerto Rican heritage, and being lumped in as a Latin American was something that he did not appreciate. In some cultures, racial identification and ethnic mix is important. In some countries, it's even culturally encoded. In some countries, it's legally encoded. When we talk about, the system is in it now, but probably the worst was apartheid in South Africa, but certainly the United States, and this is not just a Southern thing, had many laws that were euphemistically referred to as the Jim Crow laws that legally enforced racial separation. There are some places like in New Zealand where there is voluntary encoding of ethnic differences, but they don't perceive that as a negative thing. They wish very much to protect their Maori culture and to speak on Maori culture and to lead engagement with Maori culture. You need to be of Maori descent. So they are very specific on their engagement with on who is and who isn't of Maori descent. Here's what I want to talk about here when I jump back for a second and sort of delve into this. Okay? How we engage race in this country is it shifts over time and is closely tied, incredibly closely tied to how we engage, at least historically, with identifying the power culture. Now, if we want to use the term white, as it has been so often used in this country, as the ethnic group or the racial identification that holds the most, the economic, the political, and the social dominance within our culture, okay? We all have this thing we think of as white in 2019 is people that are of European descent, okay? But for a big chunk of American history, white meant you were from Britain, France, Germany, Norway, or the Netherlands. And that was it. And by Britain we mean Welsh, English, and Scottish. Okay? If you were from those 5 countries, you were considered white. you were considered able to participate fully and completely in the economic, social, and political life of the United States of America. Okay? This doesn't mean that you had the right skin tone. This means you were born and you were ethnically associated with those 5 countries. Yeah, there were some exceptions. There were some Swedes from Sweden that did, we could probably say instead of Norway, we could say Scandinavian. But the biggest group that had immigrated to the United States prior to the Civil War was the Norwegians. Okay? Well, the Civil War breaks out, and there's a desperate need for manpower. So like I was telling you about, in 1848, the Irish famine had forced 2 million of the Irish to immigrate. Many of them came to the United States. So in a desperate attempt to build manpower in the Union Army, the Union government started enlisting entire regiments of Irish Americans or Irish immigrants. Whole regiments were done. The language was Irish. They gave commands in Irish. Everyone in it, and you can see these with the 69th New York. You know, they've got the Irish harp on their regimental flags. So in 1861, 1862, they began to. The lights went out. Hold on a second. There we go. In 1861, 1862, the Union government began to say, "Okay, Irish, it's time for you to own up and jump into this war." Now, one of the reasons the Irish joined up in so many numbers was because they were poor, and this was a well-paying job. Well, after that, suddenly, after the war is over, the Irish begin to say, wait a minute, we organized as regiments, we can organize the vote. Okay, so then the Irish began to vote as a bloc. And they became very heavily engaged in what was then democratic politics. Okay, and then there was an attempt to suppress them by this existing white culture. Irish are not allowed. No Irish need apply. Those signs were all over the country. There was a very aggressive move in the 1870s and early 1880s to suppress the Irish. They did not want them engaging in the mainstream culture of the United States. Well, in the 1880s and 1890s, there became a massive immigration from Southern Europe, Spanish, Greeks, Italians, came to the United States in massive numbers. Eastern European Jews started fleeing anti-Semitic discrimination. They came in massive numbers. So suddenly, if you have Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and the Irish in opposition to this white culture, you have a balance. So what happened was the dominant culture incorporated the Irish into white culture. Okay? So the definition of the dominant culture, the dominant racial identity in the United States, became people that were immigrants from Europe, except for Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. Okay? Well, that worked until what's known as the Great Migration. In the early years of the 20th century, as industrialization in the North began to explode, as the need for cheap labor in the North began to explode, as Jim Crow laws and racial discrimination became more and more encoded in the South, African Americans by the tens of thousands began to move from the South to the industrial centers of the North. Suddenly, if you incorporate Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and African Americans, again, you have a political group, a racial group that can balance and challenge the dominant racial power structure. So suddenly, Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans become included in this group. And that's where we have the current definition of white, is that anyone from Europe, that is a descendant of anyone from Europe. So again, historically though, that term white, if it is used as the dominant social, economic, and political group in this country as an ethnic definition, the definition of the word white has historically shifted and changed. Okay? And Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a very prominent writer on racial issues now, Mr. Coates says that probably, when we talk about, well, it's going to be a minority nation, whites aren't going to be the majority in another 40 years. He has written a lot of very powerful things about how, well, no, they'll just redefine who gets to be white, and that will change. So gender or race is something we are constantly dealing with. And again, remember, first thing we said was culture is negotiated. What race you are is also negotiated. Now, what's also beginning to have a significant impact on race in our racial cultures in the United States is children and people of mixed races. There are people who don't know how to deal with that. Our culture and our laws are not equipped to deal with that. So we're going to see a lot of change. This is going to be a major cultural conversation over the next 30, 40 years. The next one, and again, I'm wading in neck deep on this. The next one we want to talk about is gender. Okay? So even your textbook sort of looks at gender binarily, male, female. So first of all, let's get this out of the way. Gender is not equal to your sex. Okay? Your sex is based on biology. It's based on, for the vast majority of people, your sex is assigned before you are cognitive of such issues. Okay? Gender is more based on your identity. Okay? We can choose to identify as male or female or neither or both. Okay? That's all up to us. We do have to accept the fact, though, when we talk about gender, we live in a patriarchy. What that means is basically a male-dominated society. We see this manifested in ways all the time. In medical research for years and years and years, and it's only just beginning to change now, the generic human was considered male. Drug studies and drug tests were not performed on women because they were considered to be too hormonally imbalanced. And it would be difficult to get a good indication of how the drug worked if they tested it on women. So drugs were tested on men as if that hormonal imbalance made women inherently disadvantaged to men. The concept that, well, maybe we should test this on women because women do go through hormonal issues that men don't have to deal with. And that made, change the way half the population of the country engages with our medication. And again, that was enforced governmental policy on how we develop medications. Okay? One of the things we've seen over the last couple of weeks, we saw it, I remember seeing it in 2016, and I saw it just last week when Speaker of the House Pelosi stood up and she was wearing a pink jacket, a pink skirt, or a white skirt, and a statement, I believe they're called statement necklace, with big pink stones. And a newspaper that I very much respect and very much read said, what to wear to win impeachment. Okay? When was the last time you saw any male politician questioned comments, a news story, based on the fact that a male politician, was wearing a blue suit, a white shirt, and a red tie? Okay? As part of our patriarchy, we still observe the way powerful women dress and feel completely okay to comment on their attire in ways that we would never do for a man. Okay? But remember that gender is like everything else in culture. Gender is defined as a social construct. Male and female roles, are not as biologically locked in as sometimes we're told. Male and female roles shift between cultures. Those roles in this country are shifting even as we speak. Even for me, and I'm not ancient, but I remember joking right after our first child was born. People would ask Barb, my wife, how long she was going to stay home. And I would just sort of jokingly, bring up the fact that this was in 1993. So it's not that long ago. Maybe it was before you were born, but historically, culturally, 24 years ago is not that long, or 26 years ago is not that long ago. I would say, I'll stay home if Barb can keep me in a style of life I've grown accustomed to. And I'll, cook and clean house. I'll be happy to do that if her salary will allow us. My wife has, throughout most of our marriage, made more money than I did. And I said, when she makes enough money that I could quit work, I'm quit work. And in the mid-1990s, people would look at me and go, really? You would do that? As if a man saying it was somehow screwed up. Women would say it and they would go, oh, you're so dedicated to your children. A man says it and they go, really? Why would you do that? Okay? But that's shifting now. The concept of what we call a house husband, a stay-at-home dad, is becoming much more prevalent and much more socially accepted. So those gender roles in our culture are shifting even as we speak. Okay? And also, transgender people becoming more socially prominent, more socially engaged, is changing our very idea of definition of gender and what it means to be male or female or both or neither. Okay? And again, linguistically, we're struggling with this because if I don't want you to use male pronouns when it comes to me, what are we going to call them? What call someone if they don't want to use male or female pronouns? We'll cope with that. English is a living language, and there'll be changes made. But again, remember, we are negotiating gender roles in our culture. Okay? The last one I want to deal with is going to be, and again, I'm picking all the easy ones. We're going to talk about sexuality. Okay? And sexuality in this country not only has to deal with homosexuality, heterosexuality, it also has up until the early 1960s, had a legal, with Loving versus Virginia, until the Supreme Court said you can't make it illegal to marry someone of a different race, okay? Sexuality had a racial component. I remember when we got married in Alabama, and we went in to register our marriage license, and behind the clerk taking care of my wife, who was from Vermont, was just absolutely flipped out by the fact that there were they kept in big leather binders in Jefferson County, and up until the last one was went through the 1960s, it had colored weddings and white weddings. And she was just flipped out that our sexuality could have a racial component like that. Sexuality defines who we marry, who we're allowed to be romantically involved with, who we can show affection to in public, and how we can show it. Again, this is quickly shifting. And again, all three of these, and the reason I'm talking about, there's all sorts of components to our culture, but I'm talking about these three because these three are shifting so quickly under our feet. Or historically, I picked race because we think of it as fixed. It's not. But gender and sexuality are shifting very quickly. Before, and I'm speaking from personal experience, and even as late as the 1980s, in some parts of the country, if two men or two women were seen kissing in a romantic way, it would have caused a riot. I mean, there are people who have been killed over that. Unfortunately, there still are people being killed over that. But that is much more widely accepted now. While some attitudes and towards some aspects of sexuality are generally fixed, culturally across almost every culture, the concept of incest is considered negatively. Others shift constantly. The term heterosexual was developed in the latter part of the 19th century, in the 1890s, for no other reason than we had a term for homosexual. Well, we need a term to describe what's not homosexuality. So the term heterosexuality was developed in the UK to put those two concepts into law. Heterosexuality would be legal. Homosexuality would be illegal. We need a legal definition. We had a legal definition of homosexuality. We needed a legal definition of the other thing, so they came up with the term heterosexuality. Up until 1974, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association defined homosexuality as a mental illness. Okay, it is no longer in that. Currently, gender dysphoria is still carried as a mental illness in the DSM. When the next edition of the DSM comes out, someone who wants to physically or surgically change, go through gender reassignment surgery, will no longer be considered mentally ill by that manual. Okay, the AIDS crisis in the 1980s forced us to confront the homosexual culture. At first, AIDS was seen as a gay disease, and literally there were many people in this country that were saying that AIDS was God's vengeance being sent down on the homosexual community. Well, by pushing back against that, and by realizing the numbers of people involved, and by realizing that AIDS wasn't necessarily, you could also get it through any number of other ways other than within that community. That pushback on that actually brought the gay community closer into mainstream. Okay, so our definition of what is and isn't accepted sexual as far as a person's sexuality, and now the new generation. When I talk to my daughter's friends, because my daughter engages a very artistic community and a very open community, I've been able to have conversations with people in their early and mid 20s, where they have absolutely no desire to define themselves either as homosexual or heterosexual. They consider those two terms to be completely archaic and non-useful for them. Okay? So as we engage, we need to be aware of that. All right? So finally, next to last, we've got two more subjects we want to cover. Intercultural communications. Intercultural communications is when two members of different cultures, two people of different cultures, engage on any level. Okay, remember we had our 7 different layers. Okay, it can be any of those 7 layers. I mean, you can be similar in 6 of those. Okay, I mean, if you remember the 6, let me find my page so I hit them all. Okay. If you're of the same national culture, regional culture, generational culture, social class culture, and corporate culture, if all those are the same, if you're of different genders, okay, suddenly you can be engaged in intercultural communication if you start engaging in relation to the gender identity of those cultures. Okay? All cultures can suffer from ethnocentrism. We oftentimes look at people, and I have oftentimes dealt with, a large part of my career was dealing with people from multiple cultures and our coalition partners. And I would always get very frustrated when I would hear Americans, including some senior military officers, go, well, why can't they just do it like we do? We know how to do it best. And Americans are Europeans were I'll say that Europeans were, the worst at ethnocentrism. Americans are pretty big on it. Every culture, the Japanese have been really big on it in the past, where they come in and they say, we're going to rebuild this in the Japanese model. There was a lot of stress here in the United States in the 1980s when Japanese companies came in and started building their auto plants here in the United States, and they expected their auto plants to run in Ohio, in Tennessee, in Alabama, the exact same way they ran in Japan, and that intercultural conflict caused significant problems. Okay? We see the good we have, we ignore the good they have or what they can bring to the table. We consider aspects of their culture that point out the flaws in ours as being unimportant. Okay? The Japanese are traditionally, in my engagement with Japanese people, they consider us to be, we waste a ton of time. We always ask, hey, how you doing? Of course, the traditional Southern greeting, how's your mom and them? Okay, Japanese don't understand that. They consider the relationships between the different levels of management to be way too informal. Okay? We consider them to be too structured, too cold, too unemotional, too dedicated to the corporate, to the company entity, as opposed to, their outside entities like their family. So when we see those things, we just go, well, that's not important. That doesn't help us. Okay, we see those things that are different, that could be considered positive, to be unimportant. Okay, intercultural relationships can face challenges not only from ethnocentricity, but also social expectations of the conflicting cultures. Definition of gender roles, how the genders engage, social engagement in cultures, and communication rituals can be quite different. Again, if you ever professionally meet with people from a Japanese culture, one of the first things they're going to want to do is exchange business cards. Because in exchanging business cards, they get to define exactly who you are and what your role is. Okay? One of the first times I had to come in and really was forced to deal with was my first time I went to the Middle East. I was flying into Qatar. I had been told this on multiple occasions, but I had been working with people from the Middle East for years. In 2004 was my first real trip to the Middle East. I was going into Iraq. I flew into Qatar. They just did not know. When I got to the counter, I was one of the very first Department of Defense civilians that had gone over to then move on to Iraq. So when I got to the immigration counter in Qatar at Doha International Airport, they just didn't know what to do with me. I wasn't military. I wasn't a contractor. Those were the only two people they had really dealt with. And I kept telling the immigration officer there that I am a DOD civilian. I do not have my passport. Okay, we weren't supposed to show passports because once you get that stamp, the Qatari government charges you like $1,500 a day if you're there to work, which I was. So I was told, don't show them your passport, show them your government ID, show them your orders. And so I showed the guy my government ID, and he said, oh, you're military? And I said, no, I'm a Department of Defense civilian employee. I work for the U.S. government. And he said, oh, you're a contractor? And I went, no. And we went back and forth several times where this little officer, lieutenant I found out later on, comes walking up, and we exchanged greetings in Arabic. He looked at his guy, and he showed it to him, and he goes, oh, yes, yes. And he said a lot of stuff in rapid fire. I don't speak Gulf dialects very well. But what I got from was that he wanted the officer to go into the office and make a copy. So I said, so he got all his stuff, and the lieutenant looks at me, who's this little old guy, and he says, we need to wait here. And I said, shukran, thank you very, shukran jazira, thank you very much. And so he stands next to me, and then he takes my hand and just holds my hand. Now, in our culture, there's a sexual component to that. There's a component tied into our sexuality of two men holding hands. In our culture, we would consider that, if not, making us uncomfortable due to the sexual component of it, we would consider it to be uncomfortable because of the control issue where he's holding me in place. In Middle Eastern cultures, when a man reaches down and holds your hand like that, what he's saying is I'm here with you. I will be staying with you. I am not leaving. Okay? It's not to control you. It's not to sexualize you. It's not to demean you. It's to say, we're in this together. I am here with you until this is resolved. Okay? It was the first time I had experienced that. I've experienced it multiple times when I was in the Middle East since then. The first time it happened, it did catch me off guard. Fortunately, I clicked quick enough because I had heard about it so often, and it had been explained to me so often that I picked it up like that, and I didn't jump or jerk or anything else. I'll be honest with you, I was very uncomfortable up front the first time that happened. I began to relax. We began to chat. I was very straight ahead, don't look at him, and then I began to chat because that intercultural norms just hit me so hard so fast. Okay? But now, if I was, in the Middle East again, and a man walks up and holds my hand, takes my hand and says, we're going this way, it would never occur to me to worry about it. Because that's just his way of, when he holds your hand, is I'm going to escort you up here. We would just go, come with me, come with me. Middle Easterners are much more personal about that and much more comfortable with holding your hand while you're doing it. Okay? So that is changing a lot. Our concept of intercultural communication is changing all the time because, we say it's a global village. One thing you do need to be aware of is, yes, we have a global village. And yes, you can get online and communicate with anywhere in the world, almost anywhere in the world at almost any time. But you do need to realize there is a digital divide. Not everybody in the world has a cell phone. I was speaking to one of my daughter's associates who is a mathematician in an African university. And the way he got to, he was a very prominent African mathematician, was attending conferences all over the world. And one of the things that he would say that would absolutely blow people's mind was that the way he could get his emails was he had to walk over to the library and print them out. Okay, so he requested that you not send him a ton of individual emails, and I found that very interesting. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about is not covered in the book. Let me move that up a little bit because I'm going to do it my right. Cultural appropriation. Okay? Cultural appropriation, according to dictionary.com, is the act of adopting elements of an outside, often minority culture, including knowledge, practices, and symbols without understanding or respecting the original culture's context. Cambridge Dictionary defines it as the act of taking or using things from a culture that is not your own, especially without showing that you understand or respect that culture. Now, cultural appropriation has got a lot of discussion in the last couple of years. I'm very glad that it's doing that because I think it's something that we need. Respect for all cultures is something we need to show, but this ain't nothing new. Okay, there was a lot of anger within the African American community in the 1950s and the 1960s when groups like people like Elvis Presley, and groups like the Rolling Stones. If you look at what Elvis was doing, if you look at the music the Rolling Stones were doing, I mean, if you go back and listen to the original Rolling Stones album, they were nothing more than American blues that was being performed by hundreds of American artists, but they happened to be African American, so they could not get played on mainstream radio until the mid-1960s and forward. So Elvis and the Rolling Stones, a group like that, sang traditionally African American music, and they made millions off of it because, to put it bluntly, they were white and they could. Okay? So cultural appropriation is nothing new, and it's also nothing specifically tied to the United States. Quick Scottish history lesson: in 1745, the Scottish people rebelled against King George. It was King George II, not the King George we rebelled against in 1776. The Scottish clans came down out of the Highlands. They nearly overthrew the king. They were trying to bring back the Stuart household. In retaliation, anybody engaged and anybody that touched that rebellion was put to death. Thousands of people were executed. And then there were some very draconian laws that came out. You were not allowed to wear tartan material, which is that plaid that we now associate with specific clans. You were not, but not back then. It was just a check material that was worn a good deal. Okay, walk back into the motion sensor. So clan badges were made illegal. So in 1820, 75 years after the Jacobite Rebellion, King George IV visited Scotland, and he saw, in museums and places, these tartans. And he really thought Scottish culture was cool. So all of the people, but remember, it's still illegal to wear those tartans and wear those clan badges in Scotland. So there were people all around London that were wearing plaids and tartans and clan badges as fashion adornments, to where if a Scot had worn those in Scotland, he would have been executed or imprisoned. Okay? And that caused a great deal of consternation. In fact, Scotland nearly went into revolt again, but George IV, or at least his ministers, were very quick, and they switched it around and repealed all those laws. And then George IV went to Scotland and wore a kilt, and everybody was all happy. And we're still wearing kilts, and people of Scottish descent, Scots, are still wearing it. Okay? So that sort of brings to light that, a lot of times the dominant culture will impose their culture on the less less dominant culture, and the minority culture does not have the choice about adopting the majority culture. It's just kind of forced on them. We think about Native Americans, the indigenous people of North America, where their children were literally pulled out of their homes and then shipped several states away to Indian schools, which is a very offensive title. And they were taught English, and if they used their native languages, if they used their indigenous languages, they were beaten. And many children died as a result of those beatings. All of those things where the dominant culture is being forced on the minority culture. They don't have that choice. For the dominant culture to then just go cherry pick the parts of the minority culture that they want to incorporate without any respect to how the cultural implications of that is really offensive to a lot of people and can cause problems. So, first of all, cultural appropriation often trivializes a violent history. A few years ago, in New York Fashion Week, one of the fashion designers had one of his models wear a traditional Indian headdress, the kind you see with the big feathers going down the back and the feathers, a traditional, what you think of when you think of a Native American headdress, that's what it was. Well, somebody pointed out to the fashion designer afterwards that the one he had picked had been modeled from a leader of an indigenous people's nation who had been executed without any real charges being brought up against him, other than the fact that he was not part of the dominant culture. So the argument was made quite effectively that trivialized the violence associated with that. Cultural appropriation can reinforce stereotypes or prejudices. Okay, and we've seen this over and over again, where a college fraternity will just be dumb. I don't know that these people are evil, but when they'll have well, I don't even want to say it, but it was let's just call it a rap-themed party where the participants picked out the absolute worst aspects of urban rap culture, okay? People wonder why we're so upset about the governor of Virginia and now the Prime Minister of Canada wearing blackface or brownface, because those have been traditionally used to reinforce racial prejudices. Okay? Sometimes things can be cool for the dominant culture, while things are too ethnic for the minority culture. I had a friend of mine report to me one time that she had started wearing, she was Nigerian, I believe, and she of Nigerian ancestry. She started wearing a traditional Nigerian head cover that was traditional for Nigerian women. She wore that to work occasionally. And then her boss, who was a female, called her in and told her that probably wasn't appropriate, it was just too ethnic, while the female boss is wearing an African print dress. And she just absolutely lost her mind. I was able to calm her down, and we went in and addressed it specifically with the boss. My boss had jumped over. I was bothered because the boss had jumped past me to call in one of my team members. That was a separate issue, but we managed to talk that out. But really, sometimes, people will say that, well, if you're wearing that, you're too ethnic. But when people of the dominant culture wear it, they're being really cool. Okay? In a lot of cases, privileged people profit. Okay? We're going to take some of your culture, we're going to mass produce it, and we're not going to give you a nickel for it. Okay? And it reinforces the economic separation. It sometimes perpetuates misinformation. Okay, for those of you who have seen the Disney movie Pocahontas, okay, that story has absolutely, what happened on that movie has absolutely nothing to do with the life of Pocahontas, which is incredibly interesting. There was a real life person called Pocahontas. It was incredibly, she has a very interesting and tragic story that has nothing to do with what happened in that movie. So it perpetuates that, okay? It can perpetuate racial stereotypes. A couple of years ago, I think it was in 2013, Katy Perry wore a traditional geisha clothes to the American Music Awards, and was roundly criticized for cultural appropriation. She came back and she said, well, she wanted it to be an homage to the geisha culture in Japan. And then people started asking her what she hoped to honor in that homage. And then she went into some of the worst racial stereotypes about the Japanese that in geishas that you can imagine. So she just reinforced a bunch of racial stereotypes. And again, like we talked about in Scotland, the dominant culture can do what the minority got punished for. And I'm not even saying that, legally punished for, okay? I don't know if you guys know, it's not, you don't see them hardly anymore, but a dashiki, which is a big flowing gown, it is a beautiful thing in many cases. It's worn by both male and females in Africa. The Iraqis have something, it's a floor length, it's almost like a shirt that goes to the floor, called it is it's not the appropriate word for it, but it's usually referred to as a dish dash. And they wear those with a jacket, and that's formal attire. Again, if I wanted, that would not be acceptable in business attire for an immigrant from Iraq who's trying to pursue a corporate career. They would be told, that's not appropriate attire. For the boss to then come in and start wearing one of those, who is of European ancestry, if the Middle Easterners the Africans are being counseled, don't wear traditional garb, and then this guy starts walking in wearing the same thing, it's very discriminatory. So the thing about cultural appropriation is, and again, I'm not going to be too worried. Now let me rephrase that. Here's the thing about cultural appropriation. It has an impact. I mean, people look for it, okay? We talked earlier in the semester about social role changing, or the way we play roles, and we may adopt different roles in different environments, okay? That's all fine, but remember that if you start to appropriate somebody else's culture and start trying to act like you're a part of that culture, which you're not, within those 7 layers, okay? That cultural appropriation is going to can cause you problems in your interpersonal communication. Okay, that's the whole point of all of this, as we talk about cultural appropriation, is that both big and small, when you start taking aspects of another culture without acknowledging fully the impact of that. And again, the one that everybody's pointed out was Rachel Dolezal, who was of European parents. She grew up in an upper middle class household. She grew up with as a child into her teen years. When she got to college, she became alienated from her parents, but she grew up with every ounce of white privilege that you can assume exists in this country. And then after she graduated college, she began to self-identify as African American. She even became a fairly high-ranking official in a regional association of the NAACP. And she created this persona that was radically different from her upbringing. And so she has been denigrated for it. She's been roundly criticized for it. So you just need to be aware of that. Okay? All right. That's chapter 8. That's culture. It was a longer lecture than I really expected, 1 hour and 15 minutes, but that's good. So we delved into it completely. All right, so by the time you see this, I will have opened up the chapter 8 discussion boards. So read the chapter, and your discussion board inputs will be due at the regular time. All right, take care. It's a weekend for us here, so have a good weekend, and we will see you next week.